But what do I say? What do I say to the person who calls and says, it's right before Christmas, I know, but I just found out I lost my job? What do I say to the person who calls and says, I just found out my spouse has been having an affair and it looks like our marriage is over? What do I say to somebody who calls and says, I just left the doctor's office and it turns out I have cancer? What do I say to the person who calls to tell me that their son or their daughter has died and they're now planning a funeral they hadn't even thought about attending? What do I say? You see, so often I think we find ourselves in these positions of trying to be comforters to people who are experiencing pain and loss and suffering. And that's the thing that keeps coming back into my mind. What do I say? And maybe part of the reason that we come back to that question is because so often we have said things that in hindsight we wish we really hadn't said. Or maybe we've fumbled over something thinking that we were offering some comforting piece of advice, only to have the person to whom we were speaking kind of come back at us and we realize maybe we've done more harm than good. This is Tim Parrish for the Huntington Church of Christ. And I'm glad that you joined us this evening for the final part of our study called Faith in a World Gone Crazy. We've been looking on Wednesday nights for a number of weeks at this idea that the world is kind of crazy around us. We're not exactly sure what's coming next. We're not exactly sure how to navigate where we go from here or where we even planned it to go from here. Our Thanksgiving was different. It looks like our Christmas may be different. Many of us are dealing with the specific in our life results of COVID-19. Maybe you or someone you love has faced this illness already. Maybe someone you know or love has been hospitalized, or maybe you've even lost someone. And whatever it is that you find yourself going through, you know that there are people who are helpful to you, and then there are people that, well, when things come out of their mouth, you just kind of would like to mash those things back into their mouth. It's hard, isn't it? Being good comforters. It's in us to want to be comforters. It's in us to want to be helpful to those people who are walking through pain and suffering. But sometimes we have a difficult enough time even just navigating our own selves and finding some measure of peace and comfort ourselves without trying to offer it to someone else. Well, last week, if you were able to be with us, we talked about the importance of silence, of learning to be quiet and the benefits that come from being silent and just being present with those who are suffering. How in our presence we listen. We listen carefully. We listen without criticism. We don't offer explanations. We don't try to offer great excuses for God. We don't try to come up with life-changing wisdom. We just listen. But there will come a time with many of the situations in which we find ourselves that there will be an opportunity to say something. Tonight, we're going to focus a little bit more specifically on what we say to those who are grieving. And a lot of times for us, that happens in a space like a funeral home or a church building, maybe even in a phone call or a personal visit. And I want to think together about a couple of ideas. One, I want us to think in terms of how we approach that and what we're trying to do. I want to think also about what we don't need to say and what we don't need to do in that particular situation. As you and I think about how to be comforting, the first thing that I think it's important to say, so that we avoid being what Job calls in Job chapter 16, verse 2, miserable comforters, is that we step into that space with one purpose: to express love and sympathy. That's it. When someone has just experienced a loss, whether we are with them at home or at the hospital or at the funeral home, when someone has just experienced a great piece of pain and loss, the most important thing we can say is, I love you and I'm sorry. Now, we don't mean to trivialize things. We don't mean to say, I'm sorry, as though we've done something wrong. We are expressing our sorrow. And maybe we say something like, I can't imagine how painful this is for you. I can't imagine how hard it is to go through what you're going through. And I just want you to know I care about you and I'm here for you. Or maybe we might say to somebody, I am so sorry for your loss. And I want you to know that I am praying for you, and I'm going to be praying for you by name every day. Or maybe we might say to somebody, I'm thinking of you. Or quite simply, we look someone in the eye and we say to them, I love you. I just want you to know I love you. Because honestly, that's enough. In that moment, especially in a place like the receiving line of friends at a funeral home visitation, that's all we need to say. One, because we're not there to monopolize someone's time, but really and truly because telling someone that I love them and I care about them, that's enough, and maybe even all they can handle. A lot of times we try in those moments to come up with something profound, maybe to share a personal story from our own life or to kind of talk someone through what they're going through, when the reality is that's too much. And unless it's really hurtful, they're not going to remember some wise thing we say, more than likely anyway, but they will remember that we were there, that we were present, as we talked about last week. And people will always remember that you say, I love you. I care about you. I'm thinking of you. I'm praying for you. I'm here for you. Because what happens when we express that with our presence and with our words, when we express love and care and sympathy, it reflects the heart of one who weeps with those who weep. It says to someone, I may not know exactly what you're going through. I may not have been through it myself. I may not understand your pain, but I need you to know that you're not alone. I may not be able to carry this in the way that you can because I can't be in your shoes, but I want you to understand you're not by yourself. I am here for you. The most comforting thing that we can do when we do speak in a moment like that is to express love and sympathy, to express concern and compassion. Anything beyond that is too much, especially in a moment of intense grief. Now, what happens with a lot of us, especially those of us that are Christians, maybe those of us who like me, have given their lives in service to the kingdom, or those who have just spent a lot of years walking alongside people who are hurting. One of the things that sometimes happens is we want to offer, maybe not an explanation, but maybe we want to offer some sort of rationalization. We want to kind of look at someone's pain and offer some sort of reasoning, some sort of interpretation. But the fact is, we really need to remember, the only thing that a griever wants or needs to know is that you are sharing in their grief. That while they are hurting, you too are hurting. And anything more can actually hurt. In fact, one of the things that I see happen a lot, and I'm guilty of having set this in motion myself, is once I go outside that space of saying, I love you and I care about you, I'm thinking about you, I'm praying for you, I'm sorry, I'm hurting for you. Once I move outside of that space and I begin the process of trying to interpret someone else's pain, interpret the events that have caused their pain, then I step outside that intimate circle of grieving. And when I move outside that circle, I step into a space that pushes me off of the ash heap. You see, we've talked off and on about Job throughout this study. And one of the things that we really focus in on, because it's so powerful, is the fact that Job's friends showed up, and for a week, they just sat with him. For a week, They sat with him in the heap of ashes, and they didn't say anything, and they didn't offer advice, and they didn't try to help him out. They just sat with him. They cried with him. They grieved with him. And at the end of that, for a moment, they seemed to give him a little bit of space to speak, to put words to his anguish, to pour out from his lips the burden that's in his heart. They do that well, but just for a moment. And then when they start trying to offer explanation, when they start trying to move into a place of giving him a solution for the situation he's in, when they try to help him get over it, then they move from the ash heap to the pulpit. And instead of sitting with someone where they are, now I'm sitting, as it were, above someone. And I'm speaking from the outside in. No, it may be that this comes from a great place in my heart, and it may be that I've experienced a very similar pain or trauma to what this person is experiencing. Maybe I'm well acquainted with this kind of grief. But when I move beyond just being there and offering love and compassion in those early moments, again, I move outside the circle of intimacy from the ash heap to the pulpit. And the last thing even I as a preacher need to do in that moment is start preaching into someone's situation. Now, in just a moment, I want to talk about some important things that we can offer people, some important things to say when the time comes that we can speak. But I also think it's really important to offer you some things not to say. I have stood by the casket of my father and my sister and my brother and my grandparents and my cousins, and I have heard people say things that were supposed to be helpful, but they were comments that immediately pushed people outside. They were things that elicited and invoked a reaction in me that was not helpful or healing, even though I knew, and I know in retrospect, those people meant so well. They were trying to offer something, but what I needed from those people in those moments was just their presence, just their love, just their care. And they quickly stepped outside of that and began to offer some interpretation of what I was experiencing. I'm sure that you have been through this too. And I hope that you haven't been too severely wounded by well-meaning people. I hope there aren't broken relationships in your life that exist because people have meant well, but said the wrong thing. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. In fact, the list in this order is not original with me, but I think it's a great list, a great place to start from. Number one, when you are facing someone, especially in those first moments of being with them in grief, do not say, "This is God's will." Now, we sometimes say that because we think if we can set some horrible event in the context of God's sovereign movement and action in the world, then it can give it some meaning. And we don't want people to suffer without meaning. But what happens when I say this is that instead of it being as helpful as I want it to be, it gives me this dark feeling about God. So what you're telling me is that this is God's fault. I'm in this because this is what God wanted? Can you explain to me how God wanted my child to die? Can you explain to me why God wanted to create this situation where this disease invaded my loved one's body and ravaged him? Can you explain to me how it's the will of God that my loved one gets dementia and forgets who I am and who they are? You're telling me that's the will of God? It's what God wants right now? Well, that's not usually what people mean with that statement. When we offer those kind of things, we're usually trying to say, listen, God is a sovereign God, and everything is a part of what God is doing in the world, and it's a part of his plan, and there are things that we can't see, and there are things that we can't know. In that moment of grief, no one hears that. No one hears that. In that moment of darkness, there are no good answers. And as a comforter, we are not there to provide answers in the first place. Even if someone in their anguish is asking questions, we are not there to try to explain the will of God, the providence of God, the sovereignty of God. Because those are things that are hard enough to understand when you're not going through grief. And from someone who's not sitting in this pile of ashes with me, it sounds awfully religiously condescending. And it doesn't make God sound like someone who could possibly comfort me if God is seen as the one who has caused my grief. So I would suggest in the first place, you don't tell people who are suffering, well, I know this is God's will. Secondly, don't say, well, I guess God just needed another angel. Or, cousin to that, well, I guess God just needed another flower in his garden. Again, I know people mean that from a really good place. But the reality is pain and loss don't make sense, especially in a moment of grief when my mind is darkened. Those things don't make sense. And it already will cause questions in my mind about who God is and what God is doing. And I need to find comfort in God's love and in God's goodness. But if you're telling me in that moment that God is not only acting according to his will, but he very specifically and selectively chose my loved one and decided that he needed them, well, that's not very comforting. Not at all. Oh, you mean it to be comforting. And I know the people who've said those things to me have meant it to be comforting. But it's not. Not in that moment, not in that space. Because in that moment, in that space, it makes me think, wait a minute, you're telling me that God, who is the creator of the universe, God who made everything that there is, needed something and he couldn't just make it. He had to take from me. He had to break my heart. He had to cause me to go through pain so he could have some benefit from it. Well, that just doesn't sound very consistent with the God of the Bible. It doesn't sound very consistent with the way that God is presented in Scripture. And, you know, one of the things that God calls Job's friends on the carpet for at the end of the book of Job, when those cycles of speeches are over and God speaks, and he speaks to those miserable comforters, one of the things that God is angry with them over is that they misrepresented him. And there's absolutely nothing in the story of God to suggest in the first place that God takes people and then turns them into angels. There are angels. There are untold numbers of angels, but they're not former humans, at least not as far as we can see in the Bible. Now, our minds may create that scenario, but the Bible doesn't reveal that to us. And there certainly is no suggestion that God, as the master gardener, is some kind of strange flower picker who takes our loved one to make some sort of heavenly bouquet. Really? Again, we mean that to be comforting to people, but in that moment of pain and grief, we may even invoke some kind of feelings of selfishness in the part of the griever. Because here I am grieving, and then you've told me that God needed my loved one. How dare I grieve this loss when you're telling me that it's all a part of God's plan to increase the angel population or put flowers on the heavenly dinner table? No, that's not a helpful thing. It's not a comforting thing. And to be very honest, it isn't biblical. It's just not true. So I wouldn't say to someone that it's God's will, even if we could ultimately make the case that in the sovereignty of God, all things happen according to his will. That's not a helpful thing or a comforting thing. Neither is it comforting to tell someone that God took their loved one to turn them into something else, or that God took their loved one to create some kind of aesthetically pleasing thing in a faraway place. In the third place this evening, even though we might mean it well and we might mean it to be true, we don't need to tell someone who is hurting, especially in those early moments of grief, that something good will come from this. In the case of someone who's burying a child, what good thing is there in the world? What possible good thing is there that they would trade for the life of their child? What possible good could be done that would make it okay to give up their child? Now, you might argue that this is what God has experienced, that good would come. And I think one of the things that we try to do is we try to move into this place of offering some hope by speaking into a dark situation and saying it's not always going to be dark. And even if it's really dark right now, there may be some light somewhere down the road that's going to come out of this. That happens, right? It happens in reality. But the truth is we have a very hard time making sense of that in our mind. We have a really hard time figuring that out. And if I say to someone in their darkest, heaviest moment, hey, some good's going to come out of this, almost without exception, that person would choose their loved one over that good. There was a moment I can think of when after my sister had passed away, a dear friend of mine made a contribution to African Christian schools. And African Christian schools were in the business of training preachers in African countries to evangelize among their own people. And that's a great thing. And someone said, oh, see, that might not have happened if your sister hadn't passed away, blah, blah. Oh, they meant that as a good thing. I was very grateful for the kind gesture for my friend, something he did in honor of my sister's memory. That's a precious thing. But in that moment of grief, if you had said to me, hey, look at it this way. Look on the bright side. Yeah, you lost your sister, your nieces and your baby nephew lost their mom, your brother-in-law lost his wife, your mom and dad lost their daughter. But hey, there's some good that's going to be done from this. Well, eventually maybe I can see that, but in my moment of grief, that's not helpful and it's not comforting. Something that's really close to that. Don't ever say to someone, well, this was for the best. Now, sometimes grievers will say this. If I've had someone who's very precious to me and they've been suffering intensely because of some disease or some terrible thing has been causing them anguish, and I see that death brings a relief from that anguish, then maybe as a griever I might speak to that. But if you're on the outside looking in, it isn't your place to tell me what's better and what's not. In fact, really God is the only one who can ultimately make those kind of value judgments, who can determine what's good and what's better and what's best. And it's not helpful to me to hear you say that this is good. Because if you tell me that good's going to come from it, or you tell me that this is the good thing, I think in both instances, we may be grossly misusing Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And Romans 8, verse 28 doesn't say everything happens for a reason. It doesn't say that everything is good. It doesn't even say that everything's going to turn out good. It says that God is working in all things, even in the bad things, that God is working for the ultimate good of his people. Now, I can believe that. In theory and in practice, I can believe that God is ultimately working for the good of his people. But there's a lot of really terrible things that others experience. And for you to minimize someone else's grief and someone else's loss by telling them, this is for the best and good stuff's going to come as a result of it. Well, can you see how uncomforting that could be? And finally this evening, just one more thing. Please don't ever say to someone in their moment of grief anything like this. Well, you ought to take a good hard look at your life right now, because maybe God's trying to tell you something. Wow. So God, the God of the universe, the supreme being in the world who can do anything because he is unlimited in power and ability, he needed to send me a message. And so in order to send me a message, he killed somebody. In order to send a message, he gave someone a terrible disease so I would get some kind of heavenly text message from him. Again, what that does in the mind of the griever, how that's heard, is not ever how it's meant. I don't think anybody would say that unless they didn't love and care for the griever and wanted to find some good that could come from this terrible situation. I can remember seeing this. With two brothers, both young guys, who were burying their sister after a drug overdose. And I can remember people saying to them, y'all better look at what's happened here, because God's trying to tell you something. Really? I mean, that's the way God chose to get my attention? Now, I'm not saying that God doesn't use things like this to get our attention. But do you understand how uncomforting it can be in that moment? Granted, I may experience a loss, and the result of experiencing that loss may be that I then take a good hard look at my life. And I hear some divine message come from this moment of tragedy, this moment of sadness, this moment of grief and loss. That may well happen in time. But in those early stages of grief, it's not good. It sounds a lot like an accusation, because it sounds a lot like you're saying, this wouldn't happen if it wasn't for you. This death, it's your fault. If you'd have just listened to God already, then this wouldn't happen. Wow. What an uncomforting thing. And yet in all of these ideas, there may be some nugget, some element, some ounce of truth. There may be something to be said for the sovereign will of God. There may be something to be said for the reality of the psalm that tells us that the death of one of God's saints is precious in his sight. There is the reality that some good may indeed come as a result of this dark moment, that maybe even for my suffering loved one and what they've been spared from, maybe it is ultimately for the best. And maybe I do need to make some changes in my life, and maybe this will spur me on. There may be some bit of truth in each one of those things, but it is not our task as comforters to try to interpret someone else's experience and bring these kinds of things. We must not forget why we are in that moment. We are there to be present with people and to listen to people. We are there to love people and to bring some sense of the goodness of God. Now, eventually, as people process and work through their grief, you or I may have the opportunity to step into a little bit of an interpretive space with them as they're exploring, as they're sorting through. Once that intense pain maybe has subsided and they're beginning to try to piece together some helpful narrative or some redemptive truth that can come to continue to ease that grief. It may be in that moment that you or I are invited into that conversation to offer some ideas from our own minds and our own hearts. So we can step into that space once we're invited into that space. But even then, we've got to be really careful that we don't try to be the official interpreter for what happens in someone else's life, because God is in the business of interpretation. One of my friends wrote this. He said, "The fog of grief is debilitating and blinding. Comforters can remind those experiencing loss about what is easily forgotten because of the consuming pain of grief. I believe those reminders must focus on who God is, how God feels about tragedy, and what God will do about it one day. Most importantly, though, I believe we need to remind sufferers that God sits on the mourning bench with them. As always, we are first silent, present, and listening before we speak, and especially before we speak of God." You see, healing comes in part as we remember who God is. Healing can come to us as we are able to see what has happened to us in the greater light or in the context of who God really is. Because some of those other things that we offer to people, what Job's friends offered to him, had some truth in it. There is truth to the retributive justice of God. But there's also the truth that some things happen for reasons we can't explain. We don't know why those things happen. There is the truth that God is not a malicious God who just goes around knocking people off when they don't do what he wants them to do. And so in this moment of dealing with people in their grief, as we try to bring comfort, as we try to bring healing, we need to bring people into God's story. And when someone asks us for what to say, instead of trying to sort through all the details of their pain, what better thing is there than to use our words in that moment to point them to the one true healer, to God himself? Now, earlier in our study, not tonight, but in weeks past, we spent some time with 5 ideas, 5 things that can kind of help us hold on to our faith, 5 things that are really important to remember when we're going through whatever it is we're going through. I want to remind you of those 5 truths because I think those 5 truths are really powerful things that we need to remember to be able to offer to people, because God reveals himself through his story, through the Bible. God reveals himself through what he has done and what he is doing in the world. And if we can show that to people and remind them that God is a God who loves, that God is a God who listens, that God is a God who understands, that God is a God who reigns, and that ultimately God is a God who wins, then we can bring people to a place where they can have a context to set their grief and their suffering in. It's the only context that allows us to ever make peace with the pain that we've endured. It's to set that into the story of God. So if you want to know, what do I say? Outside of saying, I love you, I care for you, I'm here for you, I'm praying for you, I'm thinking of you, I'm sorry. Outside of saying those things, there isn't any one thing that's the important thing to say. Instead, our words, what we say, must draw people back, must refocus their hearts and their minds and their attention on a loving, listening, understanding, reigning God who holds the ultimate victory. And that's the thing that makes it, well, it doesn't make it make sense. Some of the pain and loss we endure, it'll never make sense, not in the way we think of making sense. But as we walk through these things with others, then we certainly will be reminded that whatever pain we experience here is not for nothing. That whatever loss and tragedy we experience here, it's a part of something bigger, but we may never understand it. We may never have answers to the questions. So we find our peace. We find our hope in God. In God. And that's the way we hang on to our faith when our world is going crazy. As we finish this study this evening, I want to say a special word of thanks to my dear friend and brother, John Mark Higgs. When I was going through the darkest period of my ministry, a moment where I was under attack and being assaulted by Satan, who was using some of the people that appeared to be people of God to do more damage to me and to the church where I was ministering than I could ever have dreamed of on my own. In that moment, John Mark, who had been only a name I knew, stepped into that with me. And he offered me a place to lean into. He offered me a listening ear. He offered me comfort and hope. And I then was able to use him as a resource as I walked through some other people's darkest moments. In fact, I'll never forget the day that I was going to visit an intensive care unit at a children's hospital where a young man had gotten some really devastating news. I didn't know what I was going to say. I didn't know what I was going to do. And he said, John Mark said, I'll meet you there. I'll go with you. And he was able to enter that room as a man who had experienced the loss of a child, a man who had experienced the loss of a wife. And he was able to step into that moment with me and that family and minister to me and minister to them. Several years ago, he wrote a book called Yet Will I Trust Him. That book has since gone out of print. But just a few years ago, John Mark began condensing some of that material, began presenting it in sort of its more current form. In fact, he came to the church here during our summer series a couple of years ago and presented much this same information. It has now been released in book form. In a book that I want to offer to you as a resource, it is the book that has served as the backbone for a good portion of what we've studied through together in this series. The book is called Anchors for the Soul: How to Trust God in the Storms of Life. And that book comes along with the option for other resources, videos, group studies, study questions, and it has been, for me, a fantastic resource. It has given a lot of the material that I've shared with you over the last several weeks in this study. And so I want to take this opportunity specifically to say thank you to John Mark, to say thank you for his life and his ministry to me, but also to let you know about his book. Again, the name of the book that you see there on the screen, Anchors for the Soul: How to Trust God in the Storms of Life. I highly recommend that study for you. I'm so thankful that you've joined us this evening, and I look forward to being with you next time.